Hey guys, welcome to my world building vlog. So my name is Erin and I'm a writer. I'm working on several fantasy pieces. So I'm just doing a world building series, kind of going over some of the stuff that I've had to figure out for my stories and just passing that along to you guys. So today's topic is going to be city planning, which is another one of those topics that sounds really boring, but it's actually quite fascinating. You really only need to be aware of the basics when you're coming up with city planning, but basic infrastructure is going to have an influence on how your characters live, basically. Cities are going to need a water source to survive. That's why most cities are built on the coasts or along lakes and rivers, because they can't really survive without a water source unless they have a reliable way of bringing it into there. These types of resources, food and water and whatnot, are also going to heavily influence how big your cities can get. I know it's super tempting to have like this sprawling metropolis with millions of people, but those cities are actually really difficult to sustain, and there's not that many throughout history that have been able to do that. A good idea is to kind of look up some of these ancient cities, find their populations, and figure out how the heck did they support those people. Get back up there. So one of the oldest cities in human civilization that is still around is Jericho, and that only had about a maximum population of 2,000. So that kind of gives you an idea of what ancient cities were able to support. The largest ancient city I think that we know of was ancient Rome, which had about 1 million people in its general metropolitan area. And so you kind of want to look into that, like how was everything distributed? How do you keep a city like that running with limited resources? And I bring up ancient cities because in a lot of cases, fantasy stories have a really reduced level of technology compared to modern day. If you want a city that's easy to manage and easy to design, then you're going to want to keep your population in the low thousands. If it gets bigger than that, then although your readers probably are not going to be seeing all of this planning, it does mean your city has to be more complicated, and they're probably going to notice if your characters are interacting with the city at all, if it's very poorly designed. You want to consider, how are you keeping your population alive? Where is the food and water coming from? Are you able to store it? Things like cisterns, silos, aqueducts, all those things can kind of be looked at and considered when you're designing your city. You're also going to want to consider infrastructure. Does your city have garbage collection? Do they have running water? Do they have sewage? Do they have water treatment? Do they have street cleaning? Do these services vary between districts? A lot of times in cities then and cities now, you'll have wealthier districts and poorer districts, and the services might be different depending on how your city is laid out and arranged. It's also going to influence if your characters have a decent standard of living, because without a lot of those things, without garbage collection, water, sewage, all that, it makes it very difficult to be hygienic. It makes it difficult to stay healthy. It's going to heavily influence your character's quality of life. You're going to want to figure out kind of how your city is laid out. There's lots of options like grid patterns, rings, spoken wheel pattern. And a lot of times as cities grow, you're going to see shifts in how the cities are designed. That part is really only important if you're going to have a map, because you're going to want to consider that if the city is, 1,000 years old, then chances are the core of it is going to be a very specific way, and then as the city develops, different styles are going to be present. A good option to look at this is for Edinburgh, because the old city is built on the hill, and you'll see new sections of it that are grid patterns and just how it evolves. The layout of your city is also going to have to factor in accessibility of markets, schools, all basic services that your characters are going to need to live and grow up with. If your characters or the general populace don't have access to these things, then that's going to influence their opportunities for education, jobs, basic food, and health. If you're designing your city properly, then your characters are going to have access to all of these resources, unless it's a plot point that they don't have access to these things. Maybe they're part of a impoverished group, and this is something that they're striving to overcome. Maybe there's corrupt government, which if those things are existing, then yes, there's going to be corrupt government because they're not taking care of the people. Once you kind of know how you want your characters to have grown up, then you can develop your infrastructure accordingly. And remember, things don't need to be homogenous. They're not supposed to be homogenous because that's not how cities and cultures and everything works. There's going to be differences, there's going to be gaps. Unless you're in a perfect utopia and everything is completely equal, then sure. But in every other case, there's going to be gaps in resources and availability and basic design. So my basic advice for figuring out your city planning is to really do your research on some historical cities. There's tons of interesting stuff out there about how these cities were built and developed over the time periods, and you can see at what point they were able to start sustaining a large population. You don't have to go super in depth, but you should be aware of at least the basics so that you can have sort of an accurate representation of how these cities are working. So that's all I've got for you guys today on city planning. I hope some of that is helpful. I will put all the links to my social media in the description. Feel free to hit me up with any questions, and I will see you guys next Wednesday. Thanks for watching.